The morning sun was just beginning to warm the fields when Tom Hale stepped out of his farmhouse with a mug of coffee in his hand. He loved this time of day, when the dew was still on the grass and the world seemed unhurried. The farm was quiet, the only sounds coming from the birds calling in the distance and the hum of insects waking with the light. Tom had spent years shaping this land, planting rows of crops and keeping his property orderly. To him, it was more than soil and fences. It was his livelihood and his refuge. But that morning, something was out of place. At the far edge of the access lane, where his gravel path met the line of his field, a shiny SUV gleamed under the sunlight. Its tires sat half on his property, pressing into the grass, leaving behind tracks he knew would take weeks to heal. At first, Tom thought perhaps someone had broken down, or maybe it was a lost traveler. He walked closer, setting his mug on the fence post, and realized the vehicle wasn't abandoned. The doors were locked, and through the tinted windows he could see a bag and a pair of shoes tossed casually on the seat. Whoever had left it there hadn't gone far. Tom frowned. This was his land, not a parking lot. He leaned against the fence and waited. A few minutes later he spotted her, Corinne Masters. She was well-dressed, her sunglasses perched high on her head, and she walked with the brisk confidence of someone who never expected to be questioned. Corinne was not a stranger. She lived in the neighborhood that bordered the back end of his farm, and she held a prominent role on the neighborhood association board. Tom had spoken to her only briefly before, but he had heard her name often, usually in stories about how determined she could be when she wanted things her way. When she noticed him, she waved as though nothing were wrong. "Good morning," she called cheerfully, adjusting her purse on her shoulder. Tom nodded politely, though his jaw was tight. "Morning, that your car over there." Corinne glanced at the SUV as though she barely remembered where she had left it. "Yes, I had some guests stop by. I just needed a spot for a little while. I hope you don't mind." Tom stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. "I do mind, actually. This is my land and the car on my field. I need that access clear." Corinne smiled, the kind of smile that dismissed the seriousness of his words. "Oh, it's only temporary. We'll be out of your way before you know it. No harm done." Tom took a breath, trying to keep his voice calm. He wasn't a man who liked conflict, but he also wasn't someone who let people walk over him. "It may seem small, but this is how I make a living. Even one car can cause damage. I'd appreciate it if you could move it." Corinne tilted her head, studying him as though she were trying to decide whether he was serious. Finally, she shrugged. "I'll move it when I'm finished. It's not like I'm hurting anything." The words stung more than Tom expected. He stared at the tire marks pressed into the soft grass and felt the tension rise in his chest. It wasn't just the car. It was the dismissal, the way she made his request sound unimportant. "Respectfully, that's not your decision," he said firmly. "This is private property. I need it clear." Corinne sighed, pulling her sunglasses back over her eyes. "You don't have to get worked up about it. Honestly, it feels like you're making a bigger deal out of this than necessary. I'll only be a minute." And with that, she turned and walked back toward the neighborhood path that led behind the houses, leaving Tom standing there with the SUV still gleaming in the morning sun. For a long moment, Tom didn't move. His coffee had gone cold on the fence post, and the calm of the morning had evaporated. The field that usually brought him peace now felt unsettled. He picked up his mug and took a sip, though the bitterness was sharper than usual. As he walked back toward the farmhouse, he kept glancing over his shoulder at the SUV. He had dealt with broken fences, weather damage, and stubborn machinery, but this felt different. This wasn't nature testing him. It was a neighbor ignoring him. By noon, the SUV was still there. By evening, Tom realized it hadn't been a one-time mistake. It was the beginning of something larger, though he didn't yet know just how far it would go. The next day, Tom walked out early to check the field and hoped the SUV would be gone. But there it was again, parked in nearly the same spot as before. The morning dew outlined fresh tire tracks that cut across the edge of his property. He clenched his jaw. It wasn't just a matter of grass or soil being pressed down. It was the principle. This was his land. Tom snapped a few photos on his phone. He didn't like being the sort of person who had to gather evidence against a neighbor, but he had learned long ago that sometimes a picture could tell the story better than words. He thought about calling the sheriff's office, but he decided to try once more to handle it directly. Maybe if he was patient but firm, Karen would understand. Later that afternoon, he spotted her near the neighborhood entrance, chatting with a couple of residents. She wore the same air of confidence, her sunglasses glinting in the sun. Tom waited until she finished her conversation and then approached. "Karen," he began, trying to keep his tone even, "I really need you to stop parking on my land. It's private property, and I've got crops and equipment that could be damaged." Karen looked at him with raised eyebrows. "Oh, Tom, I thought we talked about this yesterday. It's only temporary. Besides, this area isn't clearly marked. It looks like open space to me. Honestly, I'm not sure it even counts as yours." Her words caught him off guard. "Not mine," he repeated, pointing toward the field. "That land has been in my family for years. I've got the deed, the maps, and every tax receipt to prove it." Karen folded her arms. "Well, I've been reviewing some documents through the association. There are easements noted in the records. It may be that this strip has been considered accessible to the neighborhood for quite some time. You might want to check before you get too upset." Tom stared at her, stunned. "An easement? I've never signed anything of the sort, and no one has ever had permission to park here. That's not how easements work." Karen gave a polite but dismissive smile, as though she had already decided she was right. "I'll be sure to bring it up at the board meeting. If there's confusion, we can sort it out formally. Until then, I'll continue as I have. No sense disrupting routines." Tom's patience thinned. He knew how neighborhood association meetings worked. They were supposed to be about shared spaces, community gardens, and upkeep of sidewalks, not about private farmland. Still, Karen was clearly using her role to push the idea that she had some claim to his property. That evening, Tom sat at his kitchen table with his laptop and pulled up county records. He clicked through digital plat maps and historical surveys. Every single one confirmed what he already knew. The boundary lines were clear. The land in question belonged to him, no conditions attached. He decided to send Karen a short message, attaching copies of the maps and his deed. His words were polite but firm. "This property is privately owned. Please remove your vehicle and avoid parking here again." The reply came quickly. It was written in a crisp, professional style, almost as though it had been drafted for an audience. Karen thanked him for his concern and noted that the association would review the matter at its next session. She also mentioned that neighbors had been encouraged to use convenient spaces when community events created overflow needs. Tom leaned back in his chair, exhaling. She was twisting it into something larger, something he never agreed to. A few days later, the board meeting arrived. Tom wasn't a regular attendee, but this time he showed up. The gathering was held in the community center, with rows of chairs filled by residents. Karen sat at the front with several other board members, looking perfectly composed. When the issue of shared access came up, Karen introduced it smoothly. She spoke about neighborly cooperation, the importance of flexibility, and the tradition of using nearby open areas when needed. She didn't mention Tom's name directly at first, but everyone knew what she was talking about. When Tom stood to speak, he felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him. He explained that his land was private, that there was no recorded easement, and that his crops and work were being damaged. He showed a copy of the deed and maps. Some heads in the crowd nodded in agreement, while others remained carefully neutral. Karen responded with a calm smile. "We'll certainly need to look deeper into this. The board will consult our documents, and until we have clarity, I think it's best for neighbors to continue as they have been. We don't want to cause unnecessary tension." Tom clenched his fists. "The tension is already here," he said quietly. The meeting moved on, but the air was thick with unspoken division. Tom walked back to his truck with the uneasy feeling that this was not going to end quickly. What had started as one parked car was turning into a battle of words, paperwork, and influence. And Karen, with her steady smile and confident voice, had made it clear she wasn't going to back down. The following week, Tom woke up each day with the same sinking feeling. He would pour his coffee, step outside, and scan the edge of his property. More often than not, the shiny SUV was parked there. At first, it was just Karen's vehicle. Then slowly others began to appear, 2 sedans, a pickup, and once even a van with balloons tied to its mirror. Guests from Karen's house had begun to treat his farmland like an overflow lot. Tom watched in frustration as tire tracks pressed deeper into the soil. A patch of seedlings near the lane was flattened beyond saving. Empty drink cups and wrappers were left behind, scattered by the breeze. He walked the rows each evening, picking up trash with a bucket, shaking his head at how quickly things had escalated. One Saturday, Tom decided he could not ignore it any longer. He waited until Karen's guests returned to their vehicles, and then stopped her as she lingered by the SUV. "Karen, this has gone far enough," he said firmly. "It's not just you now, other cars are showing up. They're leaving trash, damaging my crops. You need to tell them to stop." Karen adjusted her sunglasses, looking almost amused. "Tom, you make it sound worse than it is. These are just friends stopping by for gatherings. They're not causing real harm. Honestly, your land has more space than you need. Sharing a little corner shouldn't be such a burden." Tom felt his patience thin. "This isn't about space, it's about respect. I work this land. Every square foot matters to me." Her smile faded slightly, replaced by a cool expression. "You're taking this too personally. People in the neighborhood think you're being difficult. I've even had a few say they appreciate having extra space when streets get crowded. Maybe you should try being a little more accommodating." The word stung. Being called difficult was not something Tom was used to. He had always been friendly with his neighbors, lending tools and helping with small repairs when asked. But now it seemed his reputation was being shaped by someone else's story. That evening, Tom logged onto the community message board, curious about what was being said. His eyes scanned through a string of posts. Some were neutral, suggesting patience until the association sorted things out. But others carried sharp edges. One post claimed that Tom had plenty of land to spare and should not be stingy. Another implied he was being unfriendly, unwilling to support community needs. Tom's jaw tightened. It was clear that Karen's version of events was spreading faster than his own. The next day, Tom tried a different approach. He sent a polite note to the association asking for mediation. If they could sit down and discuss the issue, perhaps a fair solution could be reached. A week later, he received a response. The board had agreed to hold a mediation session, with 3 members from the association present to hear both sides. When Tom arrived at the session, he immediately sensed the imbalance. The 3 board members sitting at the table were close acquaintances of Karen. Their tone was polite, but their questions leaned heavily in her favor. "Could you not mark your boundary more clearly?" one asked. "Isn't it true that you have unused areas that wouldn't affect your farming?" another added. Tom explained his position carefully, showing maps and photographs again, but it was clear his words carried little weight. Karen, meanwhile, spoke with calm assurance. She described his concerns as exaggerated, even hinting that he had raised his voice during past conversations, something Tom knew was untrue but difficult to disprove. By the end of the session, Tom realized mediation was not going to solve anything. The board closed with vague promises to review documents and seek further clarity. Karen left smiling, as though she had already won. Over the following weeks, small acts made Tom's frustration deepen. One morning, he discovered his mailbox left open with rain-soaked letters inside. Another evening, his farm lights flickered off unexpectedly, though the circuit box showed no issues. He could not prove anyone was behind these things, but the timing made him suspicious. One night, Tom stood at the edge of his property, staring at the row of vehicles parked once again across his land. The moonlight reflected off their windshields, and faint laughter drifted across from the neighborhood. His farm, which once brought him peace, now felt like a stage where he was constantly tested. He thought about the photos, the maps, the meetings. None of it seemed to matter. Words and paperwork had not stopped the intrusion. His patience, once steady, was wearing dangerously thin. For the first time, Tom considered that he might need to make a bold move, not just words, but something that would finally force people to take his side seriously. He didn't know what that move would be yet, but the thought lingered in his mind as he walked back to the farmhouse. The conflict was no longer about a single car. It had become a test of will, and Tom was beginning to realize that if things continued this way, he would be pushed into action he had never imagined himself taking. The weather turned gray and heavy at the end of the week. A steady rain fell for 2 days, leaving Tom's fields soft and slick with mud. By Saturday morning, puddles shimmered in the ruts left by vehicles that had crossed the access lane over and over again. Tom stood by the window with his coffee, watching water drip from the eaves, hoping the storm would finally keep Karen and her guests away. But by midday, his hope faded. Through the rain-streaked glass, he spotted the familiar gleam of headlights. The shiny SUV rolled confidently onto the muddy strip of ground. Behind it came 2 more cars, their tires sinking slightly as they tried to find footing. Within minutes, the sound of doors slamming and cheerful voices carried across the wet air. Tom set his cup down and pulled on his boots. He stepped into the damp yard, his jaw tight as he walked toward the field. Karen was standing with an umbrella, guiding her guests toward her back gate as though nothing at all was unusual. "Karen," Tom called, raising his voice over the patter of rain. "This has to stop. You can't keep doing this." Karen turned, her umbrella tilting slightly. "Tom, we're only here for a short gathering. I've got a small ceremony planned and parking is limited today. We won't be long." He gestured toward the deep tire marks forming in the mud. "Look at what you're doing to the ground. Every time you drive in, you tear up more of my property. I can't just fix that overnight." She shrugged lightly. "Mud dries, grass grows back, it's not permanent." Her casual tone made Tom's chest tighten. "That's not the point. This is my land. I've told you again and again. Why won't you respect that?" Karen's voice sharpened, though her smile remained. "Because I believe the association allows for this. You're being unreasonable, Tom. You act as though sharing a little space is the end of the world. Honestly, it feels like you're trying to pick a fight where there doesn't need to be one." Tom felt his face heat. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat, running down the back of his neck, but the chill of the water couldn't cool his frustration. "I'm not trying to pick a fight. I'm asking for basic respect." Karen lifted her chin. "If you can't handle a few cars, perhaps you're not as neighborly as people thought. Maybe this whole thing should be discussed by the authorities." Her words carried weight, and not just because of her position on the board. Tom noticed one of her guests watching from under an umbrella, phone in hand, recording the exchange. The idea that this moment might end up online only fueled his unease. Then, as if on cue, flashing lights appeared at the end of the lane. A sheriff's cruiser pulled up, tires splashing through puddles. The deputy stepped out, calm and deliberate, and approached them. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking between the two. Karen wasted no time. "Officer, this man is harassing me again about parking. We've explained that the area is available, but he insists on making a scene." Tom turned quickly. "That's not true. This is my private property. I've got the documents to prove it. She's been parking here without permission for weeks, and I've asked her to stop." The deputy sighed, clearly wishing he were anywhere else on a rainy Saturday. "Look, I'm not here to referee neighbor disputes. Unless there's immediate danger, you both need to work this out through proper channels. Keep it civil, all right." Karen smiled sweetly. "Of course, officer, I'll be sure to note how uncooperative he's been." Tom clenched his fists, but he bit back the words burning in his throat. The deputy gave him a warning glance as if to say, "Don't make this harder on yourself." With that, the officer left, leaving the rain and tension behind. Karen turned to her guests with a bright laugh, as though nothing serious had happened, and led them toward her house. Tom stood in the mud, staring at the tracks crisscrossing his field, feeling powerless. That night, Tom sat in his shed long after the lights of the neighborhood had gone dim. The rain had stopped, and the air smelled of wet soil. He leaned against the wall, staring at the silhouette of his equipment in the dark. The excavator stood at the far end, silent but solid, its shape outlined by the faint glow of the yard light. For the first time, a thought entered his mind that unsettled him. He could stop this if he wanted to. He had the tools, the strength, and the will. Words and meetings hadn't worked. Respect hadn't worked. Maybe it was time to show that his land wasn't a place to be taken lightly. Tom rubbed his hands over his face, torn between frustration and hesitation. He wasn't a reckless man, but as he sat in the quiet shed, listening to the distant sound of frogs in the wet fields, he realized he had reached a breaking point. Something had to change, and if no one else was going to listen, he might just have to make them. Sunday morning arrived with a thin mist hanging over the fields. The rain had left the ground heavy and soft, the kind of soil that clung to boots and tires alike. Tom walked out of his farmhouse with weary eyes, hopping against hope that maybe, just maybe, Karen would have decided not to test him again. But as he turned the corner of the barn, his heart sank. There it was. The familiar SUV sat parked exactly where it had been the day before, angled slightly deeper into the field as if daring him to respond. The deep ruts from its tires cut into the mud, carving lines across the land he had worked so hard to keep healthy. Tom stood still for a long moment, his breath rising in the cool morning air. He thought about the conversations, the photos, the maps, the meetings, and the sheriff's visit. None of it had mattered. Each attempt to handle things calmly had been brushed aside, twisted, or ignored. He was tired of being dismissed. Slowly, Tom walked toward the shed. The door creaked open, revealing the familiar shapes of his tools and equipment. His eyes fell on the excavator parked in the corner, its yellow paint streaked with years of use. It wasn't just a machine to him. It was strength, leverage, a way to move what couldn't otherwise be moved. He climbed into the seat, turned the key, and felt the machine rumble to life beneath him. The sound filled the air, steady and commanding. For a moment, Tom hesitated, gripping the controls. Was this really the right thing to do? He had never set out to make a spectacle. But as he thought of the mud, the damage, and Karen's steady smile brushing him aside, his hesitation hardened into resolve. The excavator rolled forward, its treads pressing firmly into the wet ground. Neighbors began to notice. Curtains shifted and figures appeared at windows. A few people stepped onto porches, phones already in hand, watching the unusual scene unfold. Karen's SUV loomed ahead. Tom maneuvered carefully, the bucket arm lowering until it hovered near the shiny hood. He nudged gently at first, pushing the vehicle just enough to tilt it toward the softest part of the ground. The tires spun slightly, sliding deeper into the mud. Gasps carried from the small crowd gathering nearby. Tom steadied the controls and pushed again, firmer this time. The heavy SUV sank, its rear wheels swallowed by the muck. The glossy finish reflected the gray sky, now streaked with splatters of mud. The more the excavator pressed, the more the earth gave way beneath the weight of the car. By now, several neighbors had their phones raised, recording. Some stood with wide eyes, whispering to each other, while others muttered words Tom couldn't hear. He focused on the task, his jaw set, his movements steady. This wasn't about anger anymore, it was about making a statement that could not be ignored. Karen herself appeared moments later, hurrying down the path with disbelief written across her face. "Tom, what on earth are you doing?" she shouted, waving her arms. He didn't answer right away. He simply guided the excavator one final time, pushing until the SUV sat tilted in the mud, its front wheels almost completely buried. Then he pulled back, letting the machine idle as silence fell over the field except for the low rumble of the engine. Tom climbed down, mud clinging to his boots. He looked at Karen calmly. "I asked you, again and again, you wouldn't listen, now maybe you will." Karen's face turned red, her voice sharp. "This is destruction. Do you have any idea what you've done? Everyone saw that." Tom met her glare with steady eyes. "Good, let them." The murmurs of the crowd grew louder. Some whispered about how bold the move was, while others shook their heads in disbelief. No one had expected quiet, even-tempered Tom Hale to take such a dramatic stand. By afternoon, photos and videos of the event were circulating online. Local community pages filled with debates. Some called Tom reckless, others hailed him as a man standing up for himself. The story spread quickly, catching the attention of people far beyond the neighborhood. Back at the farm, Tom sat on his porch, the excavator silent once more. His heart still pounded, though his expression remained calm. For the first time in weeks, the edge of his field was clear of parked cars. Yet he knew the moment would not end here. The bold move had solved the immediate problem, but it had also lit a fire that could not be put out easily. Consequences were coming from Karen, from the association, and perhaps even from the law. But as Tom stared across the damp fields, he felt no regret. For the first time since the conflict began, he believed he had been heard. The morning after Tom's dramatic act, the farm was strangely quiet. A heavy fog lingered, curling low across the fields and dulling the outline of the half-sunken SUV that still sat like a stranded ship in the mud. Birds fluttered from fence posts, their chirps sharp in the otherwise hushed air. Tom stepped outside with a cup of coffee in his hand, staring across the damp ground. For the first time in weeks, there were no fresh tire tracks gouging his property. But peace was deceptive. His phone buzzed nonstop, messages, calls, and notifications flooding in. Friends from nearby towns were forwarding videos, some with captions praising his stand, others mocking or criticizing his method. The story had taken on a life of its own, spreading across social media and local news. Tom's name was in conversations he hadn't asked to be a part of. By mid-morning, a group of neighbors had gathered near the fence line. Some came with curiosity, others with concern. Among them were Mr. Bailey, who had lived on the street for decades, and the younger, who had recently moved into a new house near the farm. "You certainly made a point," Bailey said, his voice carrying both admiration and caution. "But I reckon the association won't let this go quietly." Tom nodded, sipping his coffee. "I tried everything else, Bailey. She never listened." Mrs. shifted uncomfortably. "I understand your frustration, truly, but this, well, it looks bad for the whole neighborhood. People are talking like this is a feud that might never settle." Tom didn't argue. He had anticipated disapproval. But deep down, he also sensed something else in the crowd, a flicker of relief. For weeks, Karen's actions had frustrated many, though few dared to challenge her directly. Tom had simply done what others only whispered about. Around noon, a black SUV pulled up to the edge of the property, not Karen, but one belonging to the local sheriff's department. Two deputies stepped out, their boots crunching on the gravel. Tom set his mug down and walked to meet them. "Morning, Mr. Hale," one deputy said politely. "We've had some calls about yesterday's incident. Need to hear your side." Tom explained in measured tones, emphasizing the repeated requests, the photos, the maps, the polite conversations that had led nowhere. The deputy listened carefully, jotting notes in a small pad. "Look," the deputy finally said, "we can't condone taking matters into your own hands, but we also see the record of your complaints. This situation's been brewing for a while. We'll file the report, but I suspect the bigger fight will be between you and the association." The second deputy glanced at the half-buried SUV. "I've seen plenty of disputes, but I'll admit this one's unique." Karen arrived not long after, her expression stormy. She rushed toward the deputies, pointing at Tom. "Arrest him. He destroyed my car, humiliated me in front of everyone, and now he's trying to act like the victim." The deputies exchanged a look. "Ma'am, the vehicle is still intact. It's stuck, not destroyed. And we've reviewed prior complaints from Mr. Hale. This isn't as simple as you're saying." Karen's voice rose. "So you're just going to let him get away with this?" "No, ma'am," the deputy replied firmly. "We'll file our report, but it's not a criminal matter at this point. It's civil. You'll need to resolve it through proper channels." Karen's frustration was visible, but the deputies remained unmoved. As they left, Tom caught the murmur of their radios, their voices fading into the mist. By late afternoon, the neighborhood felt charged with tension. Some people openly praised Tom's stand, calling him brave. Others fretted that his action had dragged everyone into unwanted attention. Karen, meanwhile, went door to door, knocking loudly, trying to rally support for a formal complaint. Tom stayed quiet, repairing a section of fence and checking on the fields. Yet even as he worked, he felt the weight of eyes watching. Every sound carried farther than usual, every gesture seemed amplified. The farm that once felt private now felt like a stage. That evening, Tom's sister called. She had seen the videos online. "Tom, you've stirred up a storm," she said gently. "You've got people cheering for you and others sharpening their knives. Be ready because this isn't finished." Tom leaned back in his chair, staring out at the horizon as the sun dipped behind the trees. The mud around the SUV had hardened slightly, locking the car even deeper into place. Corinne's angry shouts still echoed in his ears. No, this wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The bold move had shifted the balance, but the real battle, the one that would decide whether Tom could protect his land without constant intrusion, was only just beginning. By Monday morning, the story of Tom's bold move had spread far beyond the neighborhood. Local radio hosts were joking about the man with the excavator, and an online article even dubbed him Farmer Justice. Some people treated the incident as light-hearted entertainment, while others framed it as a serious dispute about rights and respect. Tom, however, felt none of the humor. For him, the farm was more than a backdrop to gossip. It was his livelihood and his sanctuary. Yet everywhere he turned, someone had an opinion about how he should have handled things. The real storm began when an envelope appeared in his mailbox, stamped with the association seal. Inside was a formal notice of violation. The letter accused Tom of reckless endangerment of property, disorderly conduct, and creating a hostile environment within the neighborhood. It demanded that he attend a disciplinary hearing scheduled for later in the week. Tom read the letter twice, his jaw tightening. He had expected Corinne to push back, but the language was harsher than he anticipated. It wasn't just about the car, it was about painting him as the problem. That evening, a group of neighbors gathered at Bailey's porch. The air was thick with unease as voices rose in debate. "He did what had to be done," one neighbor insisted. "If he hadn't stood up, she'd still be parking there every weekend." "But sinking someone's car with heavy equipment," another replied. "That's not just standing up, that's escalating things." Bailey raised a hand. "The truth is, we're caught in the middle. This could have been avoided if people listened to each other earlier. Now the association is stepping in, and they'll want to make an example out of Tom." Meanwhile, Corinne was working tirelessly. She had already spoken to several board members, urging them to issue the maximum fines allowed. Her voice carried through phone calls and emails, framing herself as the victim of a reckless neighbor. By the time she was finished, she had convinced several people that Tom's actions threatened the safety of everyone nearby. But Corinne underestimated something: the silent frustrations of others. Over the years, she had dismissed complaints, bent small rules, and brushed aside boundaries. While many were reluctant to challenge her directly, they had quietly kept count of their grievances. Tom's dramatic act had cracked open a door they had long wanted to push through. On Tuesday afternoon arrived at the farm. She walked into the kitchen with a serious expression. "I talked to a lawyer, Tom. You need to be ready. They might try to pin this whole thing on you, and Corinne won't back down easily." Tom frowned. "So what happens if they fine me?" "Depends on the outcome," said. "But fines can add up quickly. If she frames it as a safety issue, they might even threaten legal action beyond the association." Tom rubbed his temples. "I never wanted it to go this far. All I wanted was for her to stop parking on my land." Placed a hand on his arm. "Sometimes standing up comes with a cost, but you're not alone. People have seen what happened, and not everyone is on her side." Her words proved true the next evening. A small group of neighbors came to Tom's porch, carrying baked goods and casseroles as if to soften the tension. One by one, they admitted that while they were shocked by his method, they understood why he did it. "Corinne doesn't listen to anyone," one neighbor admitted. "She's done similar things to us, though not as extreme. You're the first to call her out in a way she couldn't ignore." Tom listened quietly, humbled by their support. For weeks, he had felt like the lone target of Corinne's disregard. Now he realized he wasn't as isolated as he thought. But support didn't erase the looming confrontation. The hearing was still scheduled, and Corinne's determination was stronger than ever. On Thursday, she marched around the neighborhood with a clipboard gathering signatures for a petition demanding Tom be fined and ordered to pay for her vehicle's damages. Her sharp voice carried across the street, calling for justice in a way that made some neighbors uncomfortable. When Friday arrived, the tension had reached a boiling point. The hearing would decide whether Tom's actions would be punished severely or whether the association would finally confront the deeper issue at hand. Neighbors whispered about the outcome as though preparing for a verdict in a trial. Tom stood by his window that night, staring out at the field. The SUV remained stuck, half buried in the hardened mud, a silent witness to the choices that had led here. The excavator sat parked nearby, its work complete but its presence looming in memory. Whatever happened at the hearing, Tom knew one thing for certain: the farm would not be silenced, and neither would he. The real test was yet to come. The day of the hearing arrived with a restless energy in the neighborhood. Cars lined the streets near the association's meeting hall, and neighbors filed inside in clusters, murmuring in hushed tones. The hall itself was a modest room with folding chairs, a long table at the front, and the board seated like judges waiting for a case to begin. Tom entered quietly, his boots polished, his posture steady. He carried a folder under his arm, photos of the tire ruts, copies of past complaints, and even a timeline of the events leading up to the incident. Sat beside him, offering silent reassurance. Karen, by contrast, swept into the room with confidence. She wore a sharp jacket and carried a stack of papers nearly as thick as Tom's. Her eyes flicked around the room, nodding the crowd. She smiled tightly, as if convinced the outcome was already in her favor. The meeting opened with the board chair clearing his throat. "We are here to review a complaint regarding the incident involving Mr. Tom Hale and Ms. Karen's vehicle. Both parties will be given the chance to present their side, after which the board will make a decision." Karen wasted no time. She stood, gesturing dramatically as she recounted how Tom had attacked her vehicle, how she had been humiliated, and how unsafe she now felt in her own neighborhood. Her words painted Tom as reckless, even dangerous. Some heads in the audience nodded, while others remained expressionless, unwilling to take sides so openly. When her turn ended, Tom rose slowly. He spoke plainly, his voice calm but firm. He recounted each step he had taken, the photographs, the maps, the polite requests, the calls to the sheriff. He explained how every effort to resolve the matter peacefully had been ignored. Then he pointed to the photos of his land, deep tire ruts, compacted soil, and damaged fencing. "I didn't want to do what I did," he admitted, his voice steady. "But I was left without a choice. My farm is not just land, it's my work, my livelihood, and my home. I asked for respect, and I was met with dismissal. That excavator wasn't anger. It was the only way left to show I was serious." The room was silent for a moment. His words carried a weight that Karen's dramatics hadn't. Neighbors began to speak up during the open forum. Mr. Bailey cleared his throat. "I've lived here for 30 years, and I've never seen Tom cause trouble. But I have seen him disrespected, and I've seen how many times he tried to handle this quietly." Another neighbor added, "I don't agree with how he handled it, but I understand why. And truth be told, many of us have felt pushed aside in smaller ways, too." Karen's face tightened as more voices joined in, not all in Tom's favor, but enough to shift the balance. The board listened intently, jotting notes, their expressions unreadable. After nearly 2 hours, the chair called for a brief recess. Whispers filled the hall as people speculated about the outcome. Tom sat quietly, staring at his hands, while offered a reassuring squeeze on his shoulder. Karen paced near the wall, muttering under her breath. Finally, the board returned. The chair cleared his throat again. "After reviewing both accounts, we have decided that while Mr. Hale's actions were unorthodox, they came after repeated attempts to resolve the issue properly. We will not issue fines against Mr. Hale. However, we strongly advise all parties to respect boundaries going forward." A collective murmur swept through the room. Karen's face flushed with anger, her lips pressing into a thin line. She started to protest, but the board chair raised a hand. "The matter is closed. Further disputes will not be tolerated." Tom exhaled slowly, relief washing over him. He hadn't expected a complete victory, but the decision lifted a weight off his shoulders. Smiled, whispering, "You did it, Tom. You finally got through." As the meeting ended, neighbors approached Tom quietly, offering nods of support, even handshakes. Some still disagreed with his method, but many respected his perseverance. Karen, meanwhile, left quickly, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she stormed out into the night. Back at the farm, the evening air felt different, lighter somehow. The SUV had finally been removed earlier that day, leaving only a muddy scar in the earth where it had sunk. Tom stood at the edge of the field, gazing across the land that was once again his alone. The grass would regrow, the soil would heal, and life on the farm would settle back into rhythm. Joined him, her voice soft. You know, people will remember this for a long time. Some will laugh, some will shake their heads. But I think most will remember it as the moment you stood up and refused to be ignored. Tom smiled faintly. I didn't set out to make history, I just wanted to protect what's mine. The horizon glowed orange as the sun dipped low, painting the farm in warm light. For the first time in months, Tom felt peace. The battle was over, the lines were clear, and though scars remained, his resolve had carried him through. And as he walked back toward the farmhouse, the sound of crickets rising in the fields, he knew one thing for certain. No one would ever mistake his silence for surrender again. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next mystery on HOA Hunter Stories.